The air in the town hall was thick with the smell of wet wool and self-satisfaction. Abram stood before Mayor Thorne and the 3 other men who ran the valley, his hands stained with dirt, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. His 6 daughters waited for him outside, huddled together against the biting autumn wind. He had just buried their mother a month prior, and the grief was a raw, open wound. His proposal was simple, born of desperation and a deep, intuitive understanding of the earth. His cabin, built for 2, was now a cramped, drafty box for 7. The North Cliff, Abram said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The sandstone there is soft enough to work, but stable. If you grant me the claim, I can dig us a home. A place insulated by the rock itself. Warm in winter, cool in summer. He paused, taking a breath. I can build an oven into it. A bakery. I can provide for my girls and contribute. Mayor Thorne, a man whose prosperity was measured in timber and land, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked at the other men, sharing a silent, condescending joke. A home in a cave? Like a badger. Thorne's voice was slick with false pity. Abram, your grief has clouded your senses. We are builders here. We raise walls with pine and oak, not scratch holes in a mountain like savages. Your duty is to your children, to provide for them with honest, sensible labor, not chase these fancies. Another councilman, a merchant named Graves, chimed in. And what would you use for currency? Dirt? The town needs lumber, not rocks. This is a foolish waste of time. The dismissal was absolute. There was no discussion, no consideration. Just the hard wall of their certainty. Thorne stood, his shadow falling over Abram. We build with timber and reason in this valley, not with shovels and dreams. Go home, Abram. Mend your roof before the snows come. That is our final word. Abram didn't argue. He had known they would not understand. He simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the hall, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him harder than any physical burden. Outside, his eldest, Anna, looked up at him, her eyes wide with question. He knelt, pulling his daughters into a tight circle, their small bodies a fragile shield against the world's coldness. We're going home, he said, but he wasn't looking at the town. He was looking up at the sheer, silent face of the North Cliff. Their home was not behind them. It was waiting to be born from the stone. He led them away from the cluster of wooden houses, away from the judgmental stares and whispered pities. His worldly possessions were few: a heavy pickaxe with a worn handle, 2 sturdy shovels, a sledgehammer, a leather satchel of his wife's belongings, and a small sack containing the last of their flour. His true wealth walked beside him, 6 sets of small feet struggling to keep pace, their trust in him a terrifying and sacred responsibility. They made their camp at the base of the towering cliff, a raw and exposed place where the wind cut like a knife. The first night was miserable. They huddled under a canvas tarp stretched between 2 junipers, the fire a small, hungry thing that offered little comfort against the creeping cold. The next morning, the work began. Abram stood before the wall of rock, a sheer face of layered sandstone and compacted earth, streaked with veins of reddish clay. It was immense, an unfeeling giant. He swung the pickaxe. The first blow rang out, a sharp crack in the morning stillness, and sent a pathetic puff of dust into the air. The rock barely registered the impact. His daughters watched, their faces pale and anxious. He swung again, and again, channeling his grief and the town's scorn into each strike. The rhythm became his prayer: swing, strike, shatter. Swing, strike, shatter. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. His hands, already calloused, blistered, broke open, and bled. He'd wrap them in cloth at night and begin again at dawn. The older girls, Anna and Beth, learned to haul away the rubble in woven baskets, their small arms straining. The younger ones, Clara and Dinah, were tasked with gathering firewood and keeping watch over the 2 smallest, Eve and Flora, who played amongst the discarded stones. From the town below, they were a curious spectacle. A man fighting a mountain. Some saw it as a tragedy, a mind broken by loss. Others saw it as righteous punishment for his pride. No one offered to help. They watched as if he were a cautionary tale, a story they would one day tell their children about the man who tried to dig his own grave. But Abram wasn't digging a grave. With every shard of rock he pried loose, he was carving out a future. Weeks turned into a month. The pile of rubble at the base of the cliff grew into a small hill, a testament to his relentless labor. He had carved out a shallow alcove, barely deep enough to shield them from the worst of the wind, but it was not yet a home. The rock was harder than he'd anticipated, and his progress was agonizingly slow. Doubts gnawed at him in the quiet, freezing nights. He would look at his daughters, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes growing thin, and the weight of Thorn's words, "Your duty is to your children," would press down on him. Then, one afternoon, the pickaxe struck with a different sound. Not a sharp crack, but a dull thud. It broke through the hard outer layer into something softer. He worked frantically, widening the hole, his heart hammering in his chest. He had found it, a dry seam of rock, a natural fissure that had been sealed by time. He pulled away the last of the loose rock and peered into the darkness. The air that flowed out was still and cool, but not cold. It was the breath of the deep earth, a steady, ancient presence. It was the first real sign that his madness might have a method. A few days later, a man appeared at the edge of his camp. He was old and weathered, with a quiet watchfulness about him. It was Finn, a trapper who lived on the far side of the valley and rarely came to town. He carried a long rifle but held it loosely, a tool not a threat. He didn't speak at first, just watched Abram work, his eyes taking in the excavated cave, the pile of rubble, and the 6 silent children. Abram stopped, leaning on his shovel, expecting judgment. Instead, Finn gestured with his chin toward a pile of reddish dirt Abram had been discarding. "That's good clay," Finn said, his voice raspy from disuse. "The kind that holds a fire's memories." Abram looked at the pile of what he'd considered waste. "It's just mud," he replied, tiredly. Finn shook his head. "No. That red mud, baked hard, holds heat better than stone. My people knew it. Good for pots, good for a hearth." He knelt and crumbled a piece between his fingers. "You mix it with dry grass, it won't crack when it heats." It was a revelation, a key turning a lock Abram hadn't even known was there. He wasn't just digging a shelter, he was excavating his own building materials. Finn glanced at Abram's worn leather satchel, its stitching coming undone. "I'll trade you the rest of that knowledge for a bit of mending," he offered. Abram spent the evening carefully restitching the trapper's pack by the fire, his mind racing, redesigning the heart of his new home. Abram's focus shifted entirely. The cave was no longer just a space to inhabit, it was a system to be engineered, and its heart would be the oven. He saw it clearly in his mind, a vaulted dome that would absorb the fire's fury and then radiate it back as gentle, life-sustaining warmth. Following Finn's advice, he began the laborious process of making bricks. He sent his daughters to the creek bed for sand and had them gather the driest grasses they could find. They mixed these with the red clay and water, stomping it with their bare feet until it was a thick, uniform paste. Abram fashioned a simple wooden mold and, one by one, began to form the rough, earth-colored bricks, laying them out in the sun to cure. Each brick was a small act of faith. He chose a spot deep inside the expanding cavern, a place that would become the center of their lives. He laid the foundation in a circle and began to build the walls of the oven upwards, carefully shaping the dome. It was slow, precise work, a form of sculpture born from pure necessity. When the structure was complete, a beautiful, primitive dome of hardened earth, a profound sense of accomplishment settled over him. This was not a madman's folly, it was an act of creation. The first firing was a disaster. He built a small fire inside the oven's mouth, but within minutes, the entire cavern filled with acrid smoke. It poured out, thick and choking, driving them all outside, gasping for air. The girls cried, their eyes streaming. Failure tasted like ash. He had been so focused on containing the heat that he had forgotten the fire needed to breathe. He sat outside the smoky cave, defeated, staring at the rock face. He needed a chimney, a flue to draw the smoke up and out. The thought of carving a narrow shaft straight up through 20 feet of solid rock was daunting, almost impossible. But looking at his daughter's frightened faces, he knew there was no alternative. The next week was the most difficult yet. He built a small wooden platform and, lying on his back, began to chip away at the ceiling of the cave with a hammer and chisel. It was claustrophobic, exhausting work. Shards of rock rained down on his face. Progress was measured in inches. His eldest, Anna, stood below, calling out warnings and passing him tools. She learned to read the stone as he did, to see the faint cracks that signaled a path forward. Finally, after a week of torturous effort, the chisel broke through into open air. A single, perfect shaft of daylight pierced the gloom of the cave. The flue was complete. The test came on a cold, grey afternoon. A palpable tension hung in the air of the small cavern. Abram carefully laid a fire of seasoned juniper inside the oven, just as before. He struck a match and touched it to the tinder. A small flame caught, then grew. He and his daughters held their breath, watching the mouth of the oven. A few wisps of smoke curled out into the room, and Abram's heart sank. But then, something shifted. A draft caught. The smoke hesitated, then began to move, not out into their living space, but inwards, and then upwards, drawn into the dark hole of the new flue. They rushed outside and looked up at the cliff face. A thin, steady plume of white smoke was rising from the rock, a defiant signal to the sky and to the town below. It was working. The fire drew cleanly, its roar contained within the clay dome. For hours, he fed the flames, packing the oven with heat until the interior walls glowed a deep, cherry red. The radiant warmth began to push back the cave's chill, creating a pocket of comfort in the harsh landscape. Now came the final proof. He let the fire die down to embers and swept the hearth clean. From their dwindling supply, he measured out flour and salt. Anna brought him water from the creek. Together, they worked the dough on a flat stone, their hands moving in a familiar rhythm from a life that felt a world away. Kneading, folding, resting. He shaped the dough into a simple, round loaf and slid it onto the hot floor of the oven, sealing the opening with a heavy, flat stone. The weight was the hardest part. The only sound was the faint crackle of the cooling embers. Then, a new smell began to fill the cave. It was a scent that spoke of civilization, of home, of safety. It was the smell of baking bread. When he judged the time was right, he pried the stone from the opening. A wave of fragrant heat washed over them. He reached in with a wooden paddle and pulled out the loaf. It was perfect. The crust was a deep, golden brown, the body of it light and airy. He tapped the bottom, and it answered with a satisfying, hollow thump. He broke it open, releasing a cloud of steam. He handed a piece to each of his daughters. As they ate the warm, life-affirming bread, their faces lit with a joy he hadn't seen in months. It was more than food. It was a promise. It was the first true cornerstone of their new home. With the oven as their anchor, the cave began to transform. The constant, radiant heat it provided made the space not just habitable, but comfortable. The stone and earth absorbed the warmth, holding it long after the fire had died down, creating a stable microclimate shielded from the increasingly volatile weather outside. Abram worked with renewed vigor, expanding their living quarters. He carved out 6 small alcoves into the walls, just big enough for a straw mattress and a blanket for each of his daughters. They were like small, safe nests tucked into the body of the mountain. Deeper still, he excavated a pantry, where the earth's temperature remained a constant, cool 50 degrees, perfect for storing food. The fear that had been his constant companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet, earned confidence. His hands were his tools, the rock was his collaborator, and his children were his purpose. He knew their survival through the coming winter depended on stocking that pantry. The town was not an option for supplies, his pride was a wall as solid as the one he lived in. So he looked elsewhere. He packed up a few loaves of his exceptional bread and some hides he had carefully prepared, and walked a full day over the western ridge to the next settlement, a smaller, less judgmental place. There, his bread was a revelation. People were accustomed to dry, hard biscuits or dense, crumbly cornbread. The light, flavorful loaves he offered were a luxury. He traded them not for coin, but for necessities: sacks of wheat flour, blocks of salt, dried beans, and a small keg of precious yeast culture to sustain his baking. He made several such trips, hauling the heavy sacks back over the ridge on his own shoulders, his muscles straining but his spirit resolute. Back in their cliff home, the pantry slowly filled. Sacks of flour were stacked against the cool stone walls. Jars of wild berries the girls had picked were lined up in neat rows. Smoked fish from the river and dried venison from fin hung from the ceiling. Down in the valley, the townsfolk saw the smoke rising from Abram's chimney. They saw him and his daughters working, hauling, preparing. They saw it not as prudent preparation, but as the final, desperate act of a man clinging to a doomed fantasy. "Let him play in his hole in the wall," Mayor Thorne was heard to say. "Winter will teach him the cost of pride." They were all busy reinforcing their own timber homes, nailing boards over windows, and trusting in the methods that had always worked before. They had no idea that the coming winter would break all the old rules. The winter did not arrive. It attacked. It descended from the north not as a picturesque blanket of snow but as a furious, roaring entity of ice and wind. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and then it vanished behind a solid wall of white. The blizzard hit the valley with the force of a physical blow, an Arctic hurricane that howled through the canyons and tore at the very foundations of the town. The temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember, freezing the river solid in a matter of hours. In their fortress of stone, Abram and his daughters were safe. The blizzard's roar was a distant, muted hum. The wind could not find purchase on the smooth cliff face, and the tons of earth and rock that surrounded them were an impenetrable shield against the bitter cold. The oven, their faithful heart, glowed with a low fire, keeping the air in their home warm and still. They had light, they had warmth, and the smell of baking bread was a constant, comforting presence. They were an island of stability in a sea of chaos. Down below, in the town built of timber and resin, it was a catastrophe. The sheer weight of the snow, which fell without pause for days, was immense. The roof of the general store groaned and then collapsed, burying a significant portion of the town's food supply. The sawmill's linter, where most of the town's cut firewood was stored, was crushed, the wood buried under 10 feet of snow. The cold was a relentless thief. It crept through the gaps in the log walls, through the floorboards, under the doors. It turned barrels of water to solid ice. It froze the ink in the inkwells and the preserves in the pantries. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning their own furniture to stay alive. The confidence of the townspeople curdled into fear, and then into raw, gnawing panic. Their sensible wooden homes had become freezing traps. Their foresight had proven to be blindness. The valley, which had always felt like a sanctuary, had become a prison of ice and snow, and starvation was no longer a distant threat, but a guest at their door. The lessons of winter had arrived, but they were not for Abram. They were for those who had believed themselves wise. For 3 days, the world was nothing but white fury. On the 4th day, the wind lessened its assault, though the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy. Inside the Cliff Bakery, the routine of survival continued. Abram stoked the oven, Beth and Clara kneaded dough, and the smell of life wafted from their chimney. It was this smell, a ghost of warmth and nourishment, that guided the first visitor. A figure appeared out of the swirling snow, stumbling, falling, and rising again, a dark shape against the overwhelming white. Abram saw them from the mouth of their cave and went out to meet them. It was Martha, the blacksmith's wife, a woman who had always offered a kind nod, if not a conversation. Her face was a mask of red, raw skin, her shawl frozen into a solid board. Ice clung to her eyelashes. She didn't have the strength for pleasantries. She just looked past Abram, into the warm, firelit cave where his daughters sat, safe and fed. "My children," she rasped, her voice cracking. "We burned the last of the chairs yesterday. The flour is frozen solid. They haven't had a warm meal in days." She didn't ask. She didn't beg. Her desperation was too profound for that. She simply stated the facts, her eyes pleading for a miracle. This was the moment Abram had subconsciously been preparing for, the fulcrum on which his entire purpose would turn. He looked from Martha's hollow eyes to the sacks of flour stacked neatly in his pantry. That flour was his family's security, their guarantee of survival until the spring thaw. Every loaf he gave away was a calculated risk, a chip taken from his daughter's future. He saw Flora, his youngest, chewing on a piece of warm crust, her cheeks rosy from the oven's heat. Then he saw, in his mind's eye, Martha's children, huddled in the freezing dark. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a moral imperative. He turned without a word and went back inside. He returned a moment later and pressed 2 heavy, still warm loaves into Martha's numb hands. His eldest daughter, Anna, followed him, holding a 3rd loaf. She gave it to the woman, her young face set with a seriousness that mirrored her father's. For the journey back, Anna said quietly. Martha stared at the bread as if it were gold, tears freezing on her cheeks. She could only whisper, "Thank you," before turning and forcing her way back into the blizzard, carrying salvation in her arms. Martha's return to the village was like a scene from a holy book. When she walked into the makeshift shelter at the town hall, carrying fresh, warm bread, a stunned silence fell over the room. The scent alone was enough to make starving people weep. It was the smell of hope. Where did it come from? The answer was impossible, yet undeniable: the madman in the cliff. Soon, another figure braved the storm, following Martha's tracks. It was the carpenter, a man who had openly mocked Abram's efforts. He arrived shamefaced and shivering, asking to trade a finely made wooden chest for a single loaf of bread. Abram gave him 2 and refused the chest. "Your family needs it for firewood more than I need it for storage," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. After that, the trickle became a flood. A line began to form at the base of the cliff, a humbling, desperate procession of the valley's citizens. They were farmers, merchants, mothers, and elders, the very people who had scorned him. They trudged through the deep snow, heads bowed against the wind and their own shame, drawn by the plume of smoke and the scent of baking. Abram and his daughters became an efficient, relentless team. He was the master of the oven, his movements economical and precise as he managed the heat, loaded the dough, and pulled out the baked loaves. Anna and Beth, their arms strong from hauling rock, took over the kneading, their hands dusted white with flour. Clara and Dinah were responsible for shaping the loaves, while the 2 youngest, Eve and Flora, carefully wrapped the finished bread in clean cloths. They worked from before dawn until long after dark, the warm cave filled with the steady, rhythmic sounds of their labor. Abram instituted a strict rationing system, not for the town, but for his own supply. He calculated how many loaves he could produce each day to ensure the flour would last, stretching his family's security to cover the entire community. People tried to pay, leaving what little they had, a few coins, a jar of preserves, a pair of mended gloves. It was no longer about trade. It was a covenant of survival, brokered by a man they had cast out, in a home they had called a fantasy. Mayor Thorne was not in the line. Not yet. For a week, the bakery in the cliff was the town's beating heart, the sole source of sustenance that kept the community from collapsing into despair and death. Abram saw faces in the line he recognized, men who had laughed at him in the town hall, women who had pulled their children away as he passed. He felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. Their hollow eyes and trembling hands extinguished any such feeling. There was only the work, and the immediate, overwhelming need. The town's social order had been completely inverted. The wealthy merchant, Graves, who had questioned what Abram would use for currency, now stood waiting for a handout, his fine coat doing little to hide his hunger. Abram treated him the same as he treated everyone else, handing him 2 loaves with a simple, "Stay warm." The act of giving, repeated dozens of times a day, became a meditation. He was not just feeding bodies, he was dispensing mercy. On the 8th day of the blizzard, a new figure appeared at the very back of the line. He was tall and stood stiffly, trying to maintain a shred of dignity in the face of utter humiliation. It was Mayor Thorne. He did not try to use his position to move ahead. He waited his turn, his face partially hidden by his collar, shifting his weight from foot to foot in the biting cold. Abram saw him but made no sign. He continued his work, pulling loaves from the oven, handing them to the next person in line. An hour passed. Finally, Thorn stood before him. The mayor, the man of timber and reason, could not meet Abram's eyes. He stared at the snowy ground between them, his pride a shattered ruin. "Abram," he began, his voice a low croak, rough with cold and shame. "My family, we are hungry." The confession was stripped of all authority, a simple, desperate admission of need. Abram looked at the man who had publicly condemned him as a fool. He saw not an enemy, but another father, terrified for his children. He reached into the basket and picked up a large, perfectly baked loaf, its crust still crackling from the heat. He handed it to Thorn, along with a second one. "No one in this valley goes hungry while my oven is hot," Abram said. The words were simple, factual, and held no trace of accusation. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a complex thing that might come with the spring thaw. This was grace, and it was absolute. Thorn took the bread, his hand shaking. He managed a single, choked, but could not finish. He simply nodded, turned, and walked away, a man defeated not by the storm, but by a quiet baker's profound and unearned generosity. The blizzard finally broke 2 days later. The sun that emerged was pale and weak, but it was there, a promise of warmth in a world of white. The valley began to dig itself out, a slow and arduous process. The immediate crisis of starvation was over, thanks to the man in the cliff, but the town was forever changed. The bakery was no longer a temporary relief station, it had become a permanent institution. The path up to its entrance, once a rough scramble, was worn into a smooth trail by the traffic of a grateful community. The town council, led by a humbled Mayor Thorn, formally granted Abram the deed to the entire cliff face. They offered to help him expand his home, to bring him supplies, to fund his bakery. Abram accepted their help, but on his own terms. He didn't want charity, he wanted partnership. He taught them what the stone had taught him. He showed them how to read the rock, how to build with earth and clay, how to create structures that worked with nature instead of fighting it. Other families, having lost their homes or learned the brutal lesson of the blizzard, began to excavate their own dwellings into the cliffside, creating a unique community that was stronger and more resilient than before. Years passed. The valley healed and prospered. Abram never moved back down to the town. The cliff was his home. His daughters grew up there, their character forged by hardship and purpose. They became the finest bakers in the territory, their skills sought after far and wide. Anna eventually took over the main bakery, her quiet competence a mirror of her father's. The other sisters established their own homes and hearths nearby, their children playing on the terraces carved from the rock. Abram, now an old man with hands gnarled like ancient roots, would often sit at the mouth of his cave, looking down at the town he had saved. He felt no bitterness about their initial rejection. He had come to understand that their scorn was the crucible in which his family's salvation had been forged. It had forced him to turn away from their world and create his own, a world of stone and warmth, of self-reliance that had blossomed into radical generosity. His legacy was not just in the bread that fed the valley, but in the profound, unspoken lesson he had taught them, that sometimes the most sensible path is not the one that is easiest to see, and the strongest foundations are built not of timber and reason, but of love, courage, and a willingness to dig for a different kind of truth.